The windswept cliffs of Port Craven loomed before Dr. Nora Flynn as her weathered jeep crawled along the narrow coastal road. The fading light of dusk cast long shadows across the landscape, transforming the rugged terrain into a tableau of ominous silhouettes. Nora's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes darting between the treacherous path ahead and the churning sea beyond. As she rounded a bend, the dilapidated buildings of Port Craven came into view. The small fishing town clung to the rocky shore like a barnacle, its weather-beaten structures a testament to generations of struggle against the relentless ocean. Nora's gaze was drawn inexorably to the horizon, where a solitary lighthouse stood sentinel on a distant rocky outcrop, its presence both reassuring and unsettling. The marine researcher had come to Port Craven with a singular purpose: to investigate the alarming frequency of shipwrecks and disappearances that had plagued these waters for decades. Her superiors at the Oceanic Research Institute had dismissed the reports as exaggerations fueled by superstition, but Nora knew better. The data didn't lie, and something in these waters was claiming far too many lives. As she pulled into the town's only inn, a weathered establishment called the Salty Mariner, Nora couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eyes peered at her from behind tattered curtains, and conversations hushed as she passed. The few locals brave enough to remain on the streets hurried past, their faces etched with a mixture of suspicion and fear. The inn's proprietor, a stooped man with skin like tanned leather, regarded Nora with undisguised wariness as she approached the front desk. "We don't get many visitors here," he growled, his voice as rough as the sea-polished stones that lined the shore. "Especially not fancy city folk like yourself." Nora squared her shoulders, determined not to be intimidated. "I'm Dr. Nora Flynn from the Oceanic Research Institute. I have a reservation." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Aye, that you do. Though I can't fathom why anyone would want to stay in this godforsaken place." He slid a rusted key across the scarred wooden counter. "Room's upstairs. Don't go wandering after dark. And for your own sake, stay away from the water." Nora raised an eyebrow at the cryptic warning but chose not to press the issue. She had a feeling that direct questions would only result in sealed lips and suspicious glares. Instead, she hefted her duffel bag and made her way up the creaking stairs to her room. The accommodations were sparse but clean, with a small window that offered a view of the turbulent sea beyond. Nora's attention was immediately drawn to the lighthouse, its silhouette stark against the deepening twilight. Even from this distance, there was something off about the structure. Its proportions seemed wrong somehow, as if it had been built to specifications not quite of this world. As darkness fell, Nora unpacked her equipment: laptops, sonar devices, and various instruments designed to measure oceanic phenomena. She spread her research across the room's small desk, poring over reports of missing ships and unexplained phenomena. The pattern was clear. Most of the incidents occurred during storms and always in the vicinity of the lighthouse. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, causing Nora to start. She looked up, her eyes drawn once again to the distant beacon. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of light at its apex, but that was impossible. The lighthouse had been decommissioned for years, its mechanism long since fallen into disrepair. Shaking off the unsettling feeling, Nora returned to her work. Hours passed as she delved deeper into the mystery, correlating weather patterns with disappearances and mapping the treacherous underwater terrain surrounding Port Craven. It wasn't until a low, mournful sound penetrated her concentration that she realized how late it had grown. The noise came again, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the inn. Nora rushed to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out into the night. The source of the sound became immediately apparent. A thick fog had rolled in from the sea, and somewhere within its misty embrace a foghorn was sounding. But that was impossible. There were no active foghorns in Port Craven. She had checked the maritime records herself. As the sound echoed once more, Nora felt a chill run down her spine. The tone was wrong, somehow. Too deep, too resonant, as if it originated from somewhere far below the waves. Unable to resist the call of scientific curiosity, Nora grabbed her coat and a flashlight. She knew it was foolish to venture out in such conditions, but the researcher in her couldn't ignore such an anomaly. As she crept down the stairs, careful not to wake the other occupants of the inn, the foghorn sounded again. This time Nora could have sworn she felt the sound in her bones, a vibration that set her teeth on edge. The night air was thick with moisture as Nora stepped outside. The fog so dense she could barely see a few feet in front of her. The beam of her flashlight did little to penetrate the gloom, instead creating a halo of reflected light that only seemed to emphasize the darkness beyond. Guided by the intermittent blasts of the foghorn, Nora made her way towards the shore. The cobblestone streets were slick with sea spray, and more than once she nearly lost her footing on the treacherous surface. As she neared the water's edge, the fog seemed to part for a moment, revealing the silhouette of the lighthouse in the distance. Nora gasped. The beacon atop the structure was lit, its beam cutting through the mist in a way that defied the laws of physics. The light didn't disperse as it should. Instead, it remained a solid column that swept across the waves with deliberate, almost sentient movement. As she watched, transfixed, the beam seemed to pause, focusing its intensity directly on her position. In that moment, Nora felt a presence, vast, ancient, and utterly alien, turn its attention upon her. The foghorn sounded once more, but this time it was joined by another noise, a low, gurgling sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the ocean. The water at the shore's edge began to churn, frothing and bubbling as if boiling from below. Nora stumbled backward, her scientific mind struggling to process what her eyes were witnessing. From beneath the roiling surface, something began to emerge, a shape so vast and terrible that her mind recoiled from its implications. A voice called out from behind her, sharp with fear and urgency. "Get away from there, you fool." Nora spun to see an old man hobbling towards her, his face a mask of terror. It was Mr. Callahan, one of the local fishermen she had hoped to interview. He grabbed her arm with surprising strength, pulling her away from the water's edge. "You'll doom us all," he hissed, his eyes wild. "The light's not for our eyes, it calls to them, don't you understand? It calls to what sleeps below." As if in response to his words, the churning of the water intensified. The foghorn blared once more, but this time it was answered by something else. A deep, reverberating call that seemed to shake the very air around them. Nora felt it in her chest, a sound so low and powerful that it threatened to stop her heart. Mr. Callahan dragged her away from the shore, his weathered face pale with fear. "Come away, Doctor. There are things in this world not meant for mortal eyes, things that should remain sleeping in the deep." As they retreated into the fog-shrouded streets of Port Craven, Nora cast one last glance over her shoulder. For a split second, she thought she saw something impossible, a massive, lidless eye, gleaming in the lighthouse's beam, rising from the tempestuous waters. Then the fog closed in and the vision was lost. Back in the relative safety of the town, Mr. Callahan finally released his grip on Nora's arm. His eyes, moments ago filled with terror, now regarded her with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You've seen it now," he murmured. "You've heard its call. There's no going back for you, Doctor. You're part of it now, whether you like it or not." Nora's mind raced, trying to reconcile what she had witnessed with her scientific worldview. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. "What's out there?" The old fisherman shook his head slowly. "That's not the right question, Doctor. The real question is, what have you awakened? And more importantly, how do we put it back to sleep before it's too late?" As if in answer, the foghorn sounded once more, its mournful tone now tinged with an almost gleeful quality. Nora shuddered, realizing that her simple research mission had stumbled upon something far more ancient and terrible than she could have ever imagined. The mystery of Port Craven and its Phantom Lighthouse was only beginning to unfold, and she feared that the answers she sought might come at a cost too horrifying to contemplate. The wind picked up, carrying with it the salt tang of the sea and something else, a scent so alien and repulsive that Nora's stomach churned. In the distance, the lighthouse's beam continued its unnatural sweep, a silent sentinel calling to horrors beyond human comprehension. And somewhere in the depths of the churning ocean, something ancient and patient stirred, awakening from its eons-long slumber. Nora knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her very core, that her arrival in Port Craven had set in motion events that could not be undone. The veil between our world and something far more terrifying had been lifted, if only for a moment, and the consequences of that glimpse were yet to be fully realized. As she allowed Mr. Callahan to lead her back to the relative safety of the Salty Mariner, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just by the wary townsfolk, but by something far more vast and incomprehensible. The true nature of the Phantom Lighthouse and the secrets it guarded remained shrouded in mystery, but one thing was certain. The horrors that lurked in the depths off the coast of Port Craven were now awake, and they were hungry. The first chapter of Nora's investigation had come to a close, but the true terror was only beginning to unfold. As she climbed the stairs to her room, each step feeling like a mile, Nora knew that sleep would not come easily. The image of that impossible eye rising from the waves would haunt her dreams, and the mournful call of the foghorn would echo in her mind, a siren song luring her deeper into a mystery that threatened to shatter her understanding of reality itself. Tomorrow she would begin her real work. Tomorrow she would start to unravel the truth behind Port Craven's curse. But as Nora closed her eyes, trying in vain to find some respite from the horrors she had witnessed, she couldn't help but wonder. In seeking the truth, would she unleash something that should have remained forever hidden beneath the waves? The night wore on, and the Phantom Lighthouse continued its silent vigil, its unnatural beam sweeping across the turbulent waters. And in the depths below, ancient eyes opened, fixed upon the shore, waiting for the next unwitting soul to heed its terrible call. Dawn broke over Port Craven, the pale light struggling to penetrate the ever-present fog that clung to the town like a burial shroud. Dr. Nora Flynn stood at her window, dark circles beneath her eyes testament to a sleepless night filled with unsettling dreams. The events of the previous evening played on repeat in her mind, each recollection bringing with it a fresh wave of dread and disbelief. She turned her gaze to the lighthouse, its silhouette stark against the gray morning sky. In the light of day, it seemed almost ordinary, yet Nora couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that emanated from the structure. The memory of that impossible eye rising from the waves sent a shudder through her body. Steeling herself for the day ahead, Nora gathered her research materials and equipment. She was determined to approach this scientifically, to find a rational explanation for the phenomena she had witnessed. There had to be a logical reason for the lighthouse's strange behavior, for the unnatural fog, for the things she thought she had seen in the water. As she made her way downstairs, the inn was eerily quiet. The few patrons she encountered averted their eyes, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. In the dining room, she found Mr. Callahan nursing a steaming mug of coffee, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he raised it to his lips. "You're still here," he remarked as Nora approached, his tone a mixture of surprise and what might have been disappointment. "Thought you might have had the sense to leave after last night." Nora slid into the seat across from him, her voice low and insistent. "Mr. Callahan, I need answers. What's really going on in this town? What was that thing in the water?" The old fisherman's eyes darted nervously around the room before settling back on Nora. He leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've stirred up things best left sleeping, Doctor. But since you're determined to dig, I suppose you ought to know what you're up against." Over the next hour, as the weak sunlight struggled to penetrate the gloom outside, Mr. Callahan spun a tale that challenged everything Nora thought she knew about the world. He spoke of ancient times, when things not of this earth walked the land and swam the seas. Of a civilization long lost to time, who built the lighthouse not as a beacon of safety, but as a doorway, a means to communicate with entities that dwelled in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. "The lighthouse ain't just a building," Callahan explained, his eyes haunted. "It's a key, a beacon that calls to something older than mankind, something that sleeps in the abyss. And now, thanks to your meddling, it's starting to wake up." Nora listened with growing horror as Callahan detailed the town's grim history. Generations of Port Craven's residents had acted as unwilling caretakers, performing arcane rituals to keep the entity, or entities, at bay. The disappearances, the shipwrecks, they were all sacrifices to appease the ancient hunger that lurked beneath the waves. But why? Nora asked, her scientific mind struggling to process this impossible information. Why maintain the lighthouse if it's so dangerous? Callahan's laugh was bitter, devoid of any real humor. You think we have a choice? If the rituals stop, if the lighthouse goes dark for too long, what sleeps below will fully awaken. And then there'll be nowhere on this earth safe from its hunger. As Callahan fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air, Nora's mind raced. Part of her wanted to dismiss it all as the ramblings of a superstitious old man, but the memory of what she had seen the night before made that impossible. She needed proof, hard evidence that could either support or debunk Callahan's fantastic claims. I need to see the town records, she declared, standing abruptly. There must be some documentation, some historical evidence of what you're describing. Callahan's face paled. The records are kept in the old lighthouse keeper's house, but no one set foot in there for years. It ain't safe, Doctor. The closer you get to the truth, the more you risk waking them up. But Nora was already heading for the door, her determination overriding her fear. She had come to Port Craven for answers, and she wouldn't leave until she had them, no matter the cost. The path to the lighthouse keeper's house was overgrown and treacherous, winding along the edge of the cliffs. As Nora picked her way carefully along the narrow trail, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fog seemed to move with purpose, tendrils reaching out as if trying to impede her progress. The house itself was a decrepit Victorian structure, its paint long since stripped away by the relentless sea wind. Windows stared out like dead eyes, several panes cracked or missing entirely. As Nora approached the front door, she noticed strange symbols carved into the wood, Eldritch designs that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of her eye. The door creaked open at her touch, swinging inward to reveal a musty interior thick with dust and the smell of decay. Nora's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating walls lined with bookshelves and display cases filled with bizarre artifacts. Shells and stones bearing the same strange markings as the door were arranged in patterns that made her eyes hurt to look at them. In the center of the room stood a massive oak desk, its surface covered in stacks of yellowed papers and leather-bound journals. Nora approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached for the nearest journal, a sudden gust of wind slammed the front door shut, plunging the room into darkness save for the beam of her flashlight. Fighting down her rising panic, Nora focused on the task at hand. She began to sift through the papers, her eyes widening as she uncovered records dating back centuries. The journals detailed rituals and sacrifices, each entry becoming more desperate as the years progressed. The most recent entry spoke of a weakening barrier, of the entity below growing stronger, more insistent in its attempts to break through. As she delved deeper into the records, Nora lost track of time. The sun had long since set when she finally looked up, her mind reeling from the horrors she had read. The full scope of Port Craven's curse was laid bare before her, and the implications were staggering. A sudden noise from outside snapped Nora back to the present. The foghorn was sounding again, its deep, resonant tone seeming to shake the very foundations of the house. Nora rushed to the window, her breath catching in her throat at the sight that greeted her. The fog had rolled in thicker than ever, but through its swirling depths she could see the lighthouse beam cutting through the night. It moved with deliberate purpose, sweeping across the churning waters below, and in its light, massive shapes moved beneath the waves, their forms too vast and alien to comprehend. Nora stumbled back from the window, her mind struggling to process what she had seen. In her haste, she knocked over a stack of books, sending them crashing to the floor. As they fell, something slipped from between the pages, a folded piece of parchment that looked ancient and fragile. With trembling hands, Nora unfolded the document. It was a map, but unlike any she had ever seen before. It depicted the coastline around Port Craven, but with additions that defied explanation. Vast underwater cities were marked in locations where Nora knew there should only be empty ocean. And at the center of it all, in a spot directly below the lighthouse, was a symbol that made her blood run cold. A massive, lidless eye surrounded by tentacles. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon or a doorway, it was a plug, a seal keeping something unimaginably ancient and powerful trapped in the depths. And now, thanks to her interference, that seal was weakening. A sudden tremor shook the house, causing dust and debris to rain down from the ceiling. Nora shoved the map into her pocket and ran for the door, her only thought to get as far away from the shore as possible. But as she burst out of the house, she found herself face to face with a group of townspeople, their eyes wild with a mixture of fear and zealous determination. "You've doomed us all," one of them growled, stepping forward. "The old ones are awakening, and it's your fault. There's only one way to set things right now." Nora backed away, her eyes darting frantically for an escape route. But the villagers advanced, herding her towards the cliff edge. The foghorn sounded again, louder than ever, and Nora could have sworn she heard something answering from the depths. A sound so low and terrible it made her bones vibrate. "Please," she begged, "you don't understand. I can help. The map, the records, they might hold the key to stopping this." But the townspeople were beyond reason. Generations of fear and sacrifice had twisted their minds, leaving them with only one solution: to offer Nora as a sacrifice to the entities below, in the hopes of appeasing their hunger. As they closed in, Nora made a desperate decision. She turned and ran towards the cliff edge, the villagers' shouts of surprise turning to horror as they realized her intent. But Nora had seen another path, a narrow trail leading down the cliff face towards a small cove below. She half ran, half slid down the treacherous path, loose rocks skittering away beneath her feet. The sound of pursuit faded, replaced by the ever-present moan of the foghorn and the increasingly agitated churning of the sea below. Nora reached the cove, her lungs burning as she gasped for air. A small boat was moored there, bobbing violently in the growing swells. Without hesitation, she leapt in, fumbling with the mooring line as she heard the shouts of the villagers growing closer again. As the boat came free, a massive wave crashed over the side, nearly capsizing it. Nora clung to the sides, her eyes wide with terror as she realized her mistake. She was heading directly towards the lighthouse, its beam now pulsing with an intensity that hurt to look at. The sea around her began to boil and churn, massive shapes moving just beneath the surface. The foghorn sounded one final time, but this time it was answered, a roar from the depths that shook the very air, a sound of triumph and hunger that spoke of aeons of patient waiting finally coming to an end. As Nora's tiny boat was tossed about like a toy in a bathtub, she saw the lighthouse beam focused directly on her. In that moment of blinding illumination, the surface of the water broke, and something began to rise. A vast, writhing mass of tentacles surrounding a single massive eye that fixed its gaze upon her with alien intelligence. Nora screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony of the awakening horror. The entity reached for her, its tentacles large enough to crush ships, and in that moment, Dr. Nora Flynn knew that her quest for knowledge had unleashed something that should have remained forever hidden in the depths. As the tentacle wrapped around her boat, lifting it high into the air, Nora clutched the ancient map to her chest. If by some miracle she survived, she knew that the fate of not just Port Craven, but perhaps the entire world, rested on the secrets contained within that fragile piece of parchment. The eye blinked, a gesture so human yet so utterly alien, and Nora felt the weight of eons press down upon her mind. As consciousness began to slip away, her last thought was a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would find a way to stop what she had unwittingly set in motion. The lighthouse beam pulsed one final time, a signal of completion to forces beyond human comprehension. And as the massive entity began to pull Nora down into the depths, the waters around Port Craven churned with the movement of things awakening from their long slumber, ready to reclaim a world they had once ruled. In the town, the remaining residents huddled in their homes, their worst fears realized. The old ones had awakened, and the age of man was coming to an end. All because one curious scientist had dared to shine a light on secrets best left in darkness. As Nora's world faded to black, the last thing she saw was the lighthouse, its light now a sickly green that pulsed in time with the movements of the monstrosity that held her. The beacon that had once been humanity's guardian against the terrors of the deep had become a herald of their doom, a signal to sleeping horrors that the time of awakening was at hand. The cosmic horror that H.P. Lovecraft had only hinted at in his darkest writings had become reality, and the world would never be the same again. The Phantom Lighthouse had served its purpose, and the barriers between our world and realms of unimaginable terror had finally, irrevocably broken down. Darkness. All-encompassing, pressing darkness that seemed to have weight, to have substance. Dr. Nora Flynn floated in this void, her mind teetering on the edge of sanity. How long had she been here? Minutes? Hours? Centuries? Time had lost all meaning in this place between places. Slowly, agonizingly, consciousness began to return. With it came sensation. The cold bite of salt water, the pressure of depths no human was meant to endure, and a presence. Something vast and alien surrounded her, its very existence an affront to the laws of nature as she understood them. Nora's eyes snapped open and she immediately wished they hadn't. She was suspended in water, but it wasn't like any ocean she had ever seen. Bioluminescent creatures pulsed and swirled around her, casting an eerie, otherworldly glow that illuminated impossible structures rising from the seafloor. Massive, cyclopean buildings of some black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it loomed in every direction. Their architecture was all wrong, with angles that hurt to look at and there, at the center of it all, was the eye. Larger than a house, it regarded Nora with an intelligence so alien, so utterly inhuman, that her mind recoiled from it. Tentacles the size of redwoods writhed around the eye, their movements hypnotic and terrifying. A voice, if it could be called that, reverberated through the water and directly into Nora's mind. It spoke no language she knew, yet somehow she understood. "Observer, awakener, you have come." The words burned in her consciousness, each syllable threatening to overwhelm her sanity. Nora tried to speak, but no sound escaped her lips. Instead, her thoughts projected outward, a feeble whisper against the entity's overwhelming presence. What are you?" A sensation that might have been amusement rippled through the water. "We are the old ones, the first ones before your kind crawled from the muck we ruled, now we return." Images flooded Nora's mind. Visions of a world so ancient it predated life as she knew it. She saw vast cities rising from primordial oceans, populated by beings that defied description. She witnessed the arrival of the first land-dwelling creatures, viewed as little more than curiosities by the old ones. And then, inexplicably, she saw the retreat. The great cities sinking beneath the waves, the old ones entering a state of hibernation, as the world above changed and evolved. The lighthouse, Nora thought, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. It was a beacon to wake you. A key, the entity corrected. A door, built by those who remembered, who waited. With each turning of the light, the lock weakened. With each sacrifice, we stirred. And now, thanks to you, we are awake. Horror washed over Nora as she realized the full implications of what she had done. Her arrival in Port Craven, her investigation, it had been the final turn of the key. She had doomed not just the town, but potentially the entire world. No, she thought desperately. This can't be happening. There has to be a way to stop this. The entity's amusement grew stronger, a sensation that sent shivers down Nora's spine. Stop? You cannot stop the tide. You cannot stop the stars from aligning. Our return was inevitable. You merely hastened it. As if to emphasize its point, the water around them began to churn. In the distance, Nora could see more shapes stirring, more massive forms rising from their aeons-long slumber. The awakening was spreading. Panic gripped her. "Please," she begged, her thoughts a frantic plea. "Humanity has evolved. We've built civilizations, created art and music. Surely we can coexist?" The entity's response was cold, implacable. "Coexist? You are less to us than the insects are to you. Your kind will serve or be swept aside." Nora's scientific mind, even in the face of this cosmic horror, refused to give up. There had to be a solution, some way to reason with these beings. And then she remembered. The map. Somehow, impossibly, it was still clutched in her hand, the ancient parchment seemingly unaffected by the crushing depths. With trembling fingers, Nora unfolded the map. As she did, something extraordinary happened. The ink began to glow, pulsing with a light that pushed back the darkness. Symbols and equations that she hadn't noticed before became visible, burning themselves into her mind. The entity recoiled, its massive tentacles writhing in what might have been surprise or pain. The old words, the binding, how do you possess this? Understanding flooded through Nora. The map wasn't just a map. It was a key of its own. A record of the ritual that had bound the old ones in the first place. Created by some long-forgotten civilization that had found a way to push back the darkness. Hope, fragile but real, blossomed in Nora's chest. She focused on the glowing symbols, letting the knowledge they contained flow through her. Words in a language never meant for human tongues formed in her mind. As Nora began to recite the ritual, the water around her started to vibrate. The bioluminescent creatures scattered, fleeing from a light that was rapidly growing in intensity. The entity's eye widened, its alien features contorting in what could only be described as fear. No, you cannot. We have only just awakened. We will not be bound again. But Nora pressed on, the words of the ritual flowing from her mind with increasing strength. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp and bend around them. The cyclopean structures began to crumble, black stone disintegrating into the depths. The entity lashed out, its tentacles whipping through the water towards Nora. But an invisible barrier held them at bay. The light emanating from the map grew brighter, forming a protective cocoon around her. As the ritual reached its crescendo, Nora felt a great rushing sensation. Water swirled around her, and for a moment, she thought she glimpsed other dimensions, realities so foreign and terrifying that her mind shied away from them. The entity howled, a sound of rage and despair that shook the very foundations of the ocean. You doom yourself, human. The binding goes both ways. You will be trapped with us. Nora knew the entity spoke the truth. She could feel herself being pulled along with the old ones, drawn into whatever prison dimension awaited them. But if that was the price to save humanity, to correct her mistake, then so be it. With the last ounce of her strength, Nora completed the ritual. There was a moment of perfect stillness, a calm before the storm. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, everything imploded. Nora felt herself falling, tumbling through spaces between spaces. The entity's howls faded, replaced by a rushing wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She caught fleeting glimpses of other worlds, other realities, as she plummeted through the void. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Nora found herself lying on a cold, hard surface, gasping for breath. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. She was back in the lighthouse keeper's house, sprawled on the dusty floor surrounded by scattered books and papers. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, and in the distance, she could hear the cry of seagulls. For a long moment, Nora lay there, her mind struggling to process what had happened. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep? But no. Her clothes were soaked with salt water, and clutched in her hand was the ancient map, its parchment now blank and crumbling to dust. On shaky legs, Nora made her way to the window. Outside, the town of Port Craven looked normal. No signs of destruction, no evidence of the cosmic horror that had so nearly been unleashed upon the world. The lighthouse stood silent, its light extinguished, nothing more than an ordinary structure of stone and metal. As her racing heart began to slow, Nora became aware of changes in herself. Knowledge swirled in her mind, glimpses of realities and dimensions beyond human comprehension. The ritual that had bound the old ones had changed her, marked her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She knew with a certainty that went beyond mere scientific fact that the threat was not over. The old ones were bound once more, but for how long? The cosmic forces at work were vast and patient. One day, perhaps in a year or a century or a millennium, they would stir again. And when that day came, humanity would need to be ready. Nora realized that this was her new purpose, her penance for nearly unleashing horror upon the world. She would use the knowledge she had gained to prepare, to find others who could comprehend the truth without succumbing to madness. A new order of guardians keeping watch over the dark places of the world. As Nora made her way out of the house and down into the town, she noticed the wary looks from the locals. They didn't remember the specifics of what had happened, but some instinct told them that something had changed, that the woman walking among them was not quite the same person who had arrived in Port Craven just days ago. Nora Flynn, once a scientist devoted to rationality and empirical evidence, now stood as a sentinel against forces beyond human understanding. The Phantom Lighthouse had gone dark, its terrible purpose thwarted for now. But in the depths of the ocean, in the spaces between realities, ancient beings slumbered and waited. And one day they would stir again. As she reached the shore, Nora looked out over the seemingly peaceful waves. To most, it would appear to be nothing more than an ordinary sea on an ordinary day. But Nora knew better. Beneath the surface, in realms unseen, a cosmic game of cat and mouse had only just begun. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her new responsibility settle upon her shoulders. The war for reality itself was far from over. It had merely entered a new phase, with humanity's survival hanging in the balance. Opening her eyes, Nora turned her back on the sea and began the long walk inland. There was work to be done, preparations to be made. And though the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, one thing was clear: the world would never be the same again.